Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Hamdan International Photography Award, HIPA. Thank you for coming, and our lecture tonight is sponsored by Nikon Photography School, and it will be presented by Mr. Karim El-Deghedy. The lecture will be about panoramic photography. We hope that everyone will enjoy and benefit from this lecture tonight. And our program is starting right now, and we'll have a break at 7:20. We'll have 10 minutes break till 7:30, and then the lecture will carry on till 8:45. Then you will have the chance to ask any questions with the lecture. You can participate and feel free to be part of this journey. And thank you again, Karim.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me well? Okay, great. So, Assalamu alaikum. First of all, I would like to thank everyone for coming today, and I would also like to thank HIPA and Nikon for inviting me to present this topic about panoramic photography. First, I would like to introduce myself. My name is Karim El-Deghedy. I was born and raised in Alexandria, Egypt. I studied business administration at Alexandria University, so I did not study, my academic study was not about photography or fine art, but I was, since the childhood, I was fascinated by the design and the graphic design, so I studied that on my own, like self-study. And I started my career very early at age of 16, at 1996, as a graphic designer. And I worked also as an instructor, so I was teaching Adobe Product Suite, so Photoshop, Illustrator, InDesign. So I spent like 10 years doing only graphic design and teaching graphic design, but I was not into photography at all until the year of 2014. So I bought my first DSLR in 2014 just for to use it for family purposes, shoot my kids, and that's it. I was not into any cityscape or architecture or anything. But then because I like technology, I wanted to understand how this camera works. So again, I did a lot of self-study to understand how to deal with the camera, adjust the settings, and make the best use out of it. And I took advantage of being in Dubai, so I went out and started shooting cityscape from rooftops, and I started to publish my photos online through social media. And the feedback I got from my friends and the audience encouraged me to develop my this hobby and produce even more photos. So my field of interest is about cityscape, landscape, and architecture. This is what really I'm specialized in. So also during my journey as a graphic designer, I became Adobe certified expert. And meanwhile, I am Nikon instructor for Middle East. I'm also Case ambassador. Case is a brand for filter for photography. Yeah. So today the topic will be about, as I said, panoramic photography, and the agenda will be as such. So first we'll talk about what is panoramic photography, and then we'll talk about the types of panoramic photography, what are the equipment that we need to shoot panorama. Also we'll talk about some technical challenges that might face you while shooting panorama and how to counter those challenges. We'll talk about some panoramic shooting techniques and composition, and also we'll talk about post-processing workflow. So how can we, after we learn how to shoot, how can we stitch all the photos together to complete and generate the full panorama. Of course, there will be a questions section at the end of the presentation. So if you have any question, please write it down, and we will cover that at the end, okay? Because we have so many things to cover. So let's get started. So what is panoramic photography? So panoramic photography is a technique of photography using specialized equipment or software to capture images with wider field of view. So to give you an example, suppose you want to shoot a scene with a very large field of view, larger than the field of view of your lens. So So even if you're shooting with a wide angle lens, it's not wide enough to cover the entire scene. So this is an example of the need of shooting panorama. This particular shot was shot in Italy, and I did it without using any special equipment. I only did it handheld, and this is actually a 19 shots panorama done in a vertical layout, shooting from left to right, and the coverage of this panorama is around 170 degrees. This is what we call the angular of view, or the angle of view. If you noticed here, if you look at the resolution for this image, is 200.52 megapixel, which is far beyond the standard resolution of my camera. I was using here D750, which is around 24 megapixel, but by shooting panoramas, I was able to enlarge the megapixel and the resolution of the image. And this is, again, one of the advantages of shooting panorama. So the question here, why do we shoot panorama? When are those situations that we need to shoot panorama? So one, if you want to expand the field of view, means that if you have, let's say, if you're shooting landscape and you don't have a wide angle lens, and let's say you have a 50 millimeter lens, you can still use the panoramic technique to expand the field of view of that lens. So you can shoot very wide scene using 50 mm or 70 mm if needed, okay? So this is one reason for shooting panorama. The other reason, as I mentioned earlier, if you want to increase the image resolution. So if you want to print the image on a very high size or big size, then of course you need more pixels to cover that area. Again, one more reason to shoot panorama. And then the third one is if you want to decrease the barrel distortion of the lens. So the barrel distortion, you know, if you are shooting with a wide angle lens, usually you get curved lines at the edge of the image. This is what we call barrel distortion. So if I want to shoot a panorama with, or an image with very minimum distortion, so rather than shooting at a wide angle like 16 mm or 14 mm, I can shoot at 70 millimeter or 80 or 50, which has less barrel distortion, and I can, at the same time, I can cover the entire field of view that I need. So this is one situation that you will need also to use panorama if you want to minimize the distortion. Okay? So I was talking about angle of view. So what is an angle of view? So the angle of view is actually an angle that measures your vision as a human. So, you know, as a human, we can see up to 124 degrees. This is our angle of view, from right to left or left to right. This is how we measure it. Now, each lens also has its own angle of view. So, for example, the 14 millimeter lens has an angle of view of 104.3 degrees. And that's what we call the horizontal angle of view. Now, also there is a vertical angle of view, so how high and low the lens can see, all right? And if you're gonna buy a lens online or through a shop, most probably you will see AOV, or the angle of view, written on the specs of the lens. And whatever is written over there is not either the horizontal or the vertical. Usually it is the diagonal field of view of that particular lens, okay? So it is much bigger than the horizontal and the vertical. So as you can see, the human eye can see wider than most of the common lenses that we have in terms of wide angle. However, there are exceptions. If you are shooting with a fisheye lens, this can cover up to 180 degrees of angle of view. So it is bigger than what a human can normally see. So why I'm telling you this? Because one reason for defining a panorama is that it should cover an angle of view wider than a human can see. So if you are covering less what a human can see, like less than 124, some people, they don't consider that as panorama. Okay, so this is one of the criteria to define a panoramic image. The other criteria, which is important, is the aspect ratio between the width and the height of your photo. So these are the standard aspect ratios for a panorama. So it could be 2:1 or 3 by 1, 4 by 1, or 5 by 1. All these are accepted aspect ratios for panorama. Okay? Of course, here I'm talking about the single row panorama, because soon we'll talk about different types of panorama like multi-row and 360 the panorama. This is a different story. But when talking about single row panorama, these are the aspect ratios. So if I say 1 by 1 square, that's not a panoramic aspect ratio. So types of panoramic photography. One technique to create a panorama, which is very straightforward and simple, is to get a standard image shot at 2 by 3 aspect ratio, and then you can crop that image to create an aspect ratio of 1:3 or 1:4 or 1:5. That will simulate panoramic result. It's very straightforward. I don't need any special equipment. It's one image is enough to do the trick. However, there are some pros and cons for that. So the pros that it doesn't require any special equipment, and it is suitable when you have movement in the scene. So you don't want to shoot multiple shots to cover your panorama. If you have moving subjects, this can create some ghosting, you know. So one shot will capture even the moving subjects, and then I can crop that into the aspect ratio of the panorama. Now, in the past, there were some film cameras that have the film in aspect ratio 3:1. So you can shoot panorama with one click. So this is a standard technique even in the film cameras. But in digital photography now, we don't have this aspect ratio, neither in the full frame or the crop sensor. So we can crop the image in post-processing as such. Now, the cons for this approach, of course, you will lose image resolution because you are cutting pixels from the original image, and then that might not be suitable for large prints. It could only be good for, you know, web use. Now, another type of panorama is what we call multiple images panorama. So this is, I need to shoot more than one image to compose or generate my panorama. So this is a shot I took in Paris. This is a vertorama, so vertical shot, starting from the ground all the way to the top. And I'm using here a tilt shift lens, which I will explain later how does it work. Okay? So the distance between me standing here and the subject was very, very narrow. But I want to cover the ground, so I want to use this as leading lines to my subject. And at the same time, I want to maintain all the vertical lines straight. So that's why I used a special lens called tilt shift, which I, again, will talk about, to take multiple shots from the ground all the way up to cover a larger field of view while maintaining the vertical lines straight. Okay? Again, the advantage of multiple images panorama is, again, increasing image resolution. But then the problem is that it might require some extra equipment to capture such shots. So either, of course, a tripod or a special lens to do that, or a special panoramic head, which I will talk about later. Now, this could limit the amount of movement in your scene because you're shooting multiple shots, and if you have any moving subject, that could create ghosting. Again, that could be fixed later on in post-processing, but just bear that in mind, and it needs some time to set up. And of course, you will need to have special software to stitch all these photos together to generate that full image. Another example of multiple images, what we call the single row panorama. So here I'm panning from left to right in vertical orientation with my camera, and then I'm maintaining here an overlap around 25 to 30% between each shot. So these are 4 vertical shots covering around 180 degrees angle of view, shot at 16 mm, and the total image resolution is 38 megapixels. Okay? So this is an example of single row panorama. Of course, for that type of panorama, you will need either special equipment to make it straight and get the best results out of the camera. You can still use handheld technique, but you have to put some things in mind before you shoot handheld. And I will explain later how can you shoot handheld, something like that. Okay? This is another example of multiple images panorama, but this one is multiple rows. So here I wanted to cover this one. This one was taken from Cayenne Tower, and I wanted to cover the sky because I have dramatic clouds and also the foreground. Okay, so what I have done, I shot 3 images in the first row, again in vertical orientation, and then I switched down to do a second row and cover the lower part. So total I have 6 tiles stitched together, and again I'm maintaining the overlap, which is 30% to 25% between each shot. So in this example I used a lens called 24 millimeter tilt shift lens, and it's shot, as I mentioned, 6 shots by 2 rows and 3 columns. Now, before I deep dive into the next slides, there are some definitions that we need to understand first before we move on. So I want to talk about something we call parallax. Okay. So what is parallax? Parallax actually, we can understand it like so. So if you are, let's say, having a scene like that, you have a tree, and then you have someone standing in the background, and let's say we have 3 different houses, all right, in different colors. Now, if you're looking at that tree from a certain perspective, let's say from A perspective, this is what you will get. So you will see the tree projected on the red house, and the human or the person will be in the middle. Now, if you walk all the way down and look from that side, what will happen? The tree will show or be projected on the yellow house, and still the person is in the middle. But if you notice here, the person is not perfectly in the middle. Here, the person was a bit shifted to the right, and here the bit shifted to the left. So in both cases, the subject that is between you, maybe the camera, and the background will change its position relative to the movement of your eye or head, or relative to the movement of the camera. So when you are shooting panorama, you may encounter the same problem. So you are panning, let's say, from right to left, and you have a subject in the foreground, like a tree, and then you have a building in the background. On the first frame, the tree will appear on the right side, but then when you pan to the right, the tree will appear on the left side, on a different building. Now imagine what will happen when you put these 2 images in the stitching software. It will get confused, right? Because it doesn't know where is the tree. It should be on the left or the right. So most probably you will end up having what we call ghosting. So it will show the tree on 2 different parts of the image, and maybe your panorama will fail and you cannot stitch it. So that could also lead into failure. So we have to learn how can we control this. How can we eliminate the parallax effect? Parallax could be nice if you are doing some time lapse. If you're doing video shooting, then yes, you want to show the 3D effect. But when it comes to panorama, it's your biggest enemy. You want to minimize that as much as possible. Now, to reduce parallax, we use a special type of equipment. We call that a nodal rail. Again, I will show you live how to set it up and how to calibrate the nodal rail. But the idea here is that you need to move the camera backward to make the camera rotate around the axis of what we call the entrance pupil of the lens. So let me explain that. Usually, when you put your camera on the tripod without this nodal rail, and when you are panning on the axis of the camera itself, right? So what will happen? The front element of your lens will change perspective because you are rotating, and then on that side, the lens will be facing that direction, and then on the other side, it will face that direction, but then between both, you will have different type of perspective. Now, if you shift the rotation axis to the front element, then you will minimize that impact, the change of perspective between the lens movement. Okay? When I show that to you live soon, you will understand it better. Okay? So we'll do the live demo and we'll show you how to fix the parallax effect using a nodal rail. So in the next part of the presentation, we'll talk about assembling a panorama. So we'll talk about the gear, the shooting techniques, and many other stuff. So first of all, you're going to need, of course, a camera to shoot a panorama. Now, it doesn't matter which type of camera. You can use point and shoot, DSLR, any camera will do, even your phone. You can create a panorama using your phone. However, in some situations, you will need to have a proper camera that's able to give you control on the exposure. So it has a manual mode, to adjust the exposure settings easily. So most probably you will need a camera. If you are serious in photography, in panoramic photography, then the point and shoot will not cover all the situations. Okay. Now, when it comes to lenses, again, there is no good or bad lens. You can use a wide-angle lens or a telephoto. It doesn't matter. But you have to bear in mind that each one will give you definitely different results. Now, when you're using a wide-angle lens to shoot a panorama, usually what will happen, the elements in the foreground will appear larger, and then the elements in the background will appear smaller. So if you're shooting a landscape and you have mountains and then some trees, and you're using a wide-angle lens, the trees will look very big, but then the mountains will look so small. And that could be against your wish. You want to have the mountains to be the hero of the photo. In that case, you should not use a wide-angle lens in this situation. So instead, you should use a telephoto, so you can shoot at 70 mm or even higher to magnify the subject in the background, okay, and make it the dominant element in your scene. So the first shot of panorama that I show you was using a 70-200 mm, and I was shooting at 70 millimeter. The first example, the one with the 19 shots. And the reason is I had mountains in the background, and I wanted those mountains to show as big as possible. Now, there is also different type of lenses. I call them specialized or special lenses, like the fisheye lens. This one has a focal range between 8 to 15 mm. This is ideal for shooting 360 degrees by 180. So it covers an entire sphere of panorama. Like, if you have tried before virtual reality, and to look up and look down and look all the ways, these type of panoramas usually created with similar lenses. It has a very wide coverage. Of course, it will produce lots of distortion, but that's not a big problem, because the stitching software will be able to handle that distortion and give you the 360 coverage at the end of the day. So you can cover a 360 panorama by 180 using this lens in 6 frames horizontally, with 1 frame for the top and 1 frame for the bottom. And this can cover the entire 360 scene. Now, this other lens, and this is my favorite, personal favorite, the 19 mm tilt shift. This is ideal for all different types of panoramas, and it's perfectly used when you are shooting vertical panoramas, like the example I showed you earlier in France. So with the tilt shift, I can shift the lens up, and I can cover multiple images without moving my camera. I'll explain again how does it work. And because I'm not panning my camera either up or down or left or right, I'm not getting any change in the perspective, and that will eliminate the parallax by default without using the nodal rail that I explained earlier. So when you're using the tilt shift lens, you don't need to put a nodal rail, because your camera is not panning left and right. You are just shifting the lens left and right or up and down. Okay? When it comes to tripods and bases, so this is what I use. So any tripod will do, but you want to make sure it is sturdy enough. Again, you can shoot a panorama using standard ball head that has a panning feature. So some ball heads, they don't have this capability to pan. So if you have a ball head with a panning gear, that's fine. Also, an L bracket can help you easily switch the camera orientation from horizontal format to vertical format without need to realign your tripod after leveling it. So usually, when you go to the scene, you set up the tripod, you make sure it is level before you shoot the panorama, and then let's say you took a series of shots in horizontal mode, okay? And then after that, you wanted to change the orientation to vertical, maybe because you want to have more megapixel or you want to avoid cropping from top to bottom later on when you're doing the stitching. So rather than tilting the whole ball head to change the orientation, you keep the ball head straight, and then you just use the L bracket to switch the camera from the vertical to the horizontal mode. Also, a leveling base can help you. This is a piece of equipment that you can attach between the ball head and the tripod, and this can allow you to easily level your tripod without the need to use the tripod legs to balance or level the tripod. So sometimes you have to extend the legs, in order to level that camera. And if you have a terrain that that doesn't have any, it's not smooth ground like some rocks or so, it's difficult to adjust the level just by expanding the tripod legs. So this makes it so easy to level your camera. You may also see this equipment. This is what we call panorama clamp. So this can be attached on the tripod, and you start taking single row panoramic shot. But again, this cannot eliminate the parallax problem. Okay, so if you don't have a ball head, you can use this on top of your tripod to pan the camera horizontally. This is its older brother, so index rotator. So this allows you to pan as well horizontally. But the good thing about this one is that you can define the number of stops or the angles where the camera should stop while panning. Sometimes you may be shooting in the dark, okay? And it's difficult to read the measurement on the panning head because you want to stop, let's say, every 30 degrees. So what you can do, you can just lock this at the desired angle. So let's say at 10 degrees or 24 degrees or 30 degrees. And then the moment you start panning, it will automatically stop when you reach to that degree. So every 30 degrees, it will stop. So even if you're shooting in the dark, you can feel that, break. And then you know that, okay, this is the end of frame 1, and now this is the beginning of frame 2, and so on. Also, another use of this is that while you're shooting a panorama, let's say from right to left, sometimes you may need to recompose or retake one of the tiles. So suppose you're shooting a landscape or cityscape, and then you start shooting from left to right, and then at frame number 3, you realize that, okay, there is an interesting cloud now in frame number 1, and I want to capture that. Or maybe there was a moving subject in frame number 1, and that moving subject is gone. So I want to retake the same frame so I can stitch it later. You know what I mean? So with this equipment, I can go back exactly to the same spot on frame number 1, recapture the scene, and then continue my panoramic shooting as normal. So you start 1, 2, 3, and then before going to 4, you go back to 1, shoot 1, and then you go back to 4 and continue. So you can easily jump back and forth between each tile precisely using these stops. Clear? Great. Now, the nodal slide rail, again, this is very important if you want to eliminate the parallax effect. And again, we'll talk about it in depth later. Now, there is also a special type of equipment, we call it panoramic heads. So this is like a set of different equipments to help you create any type of panorama. So it could be 360 degrees or sphere or even single row. So the first type of panoramic heads, we call that cylindric panoramic head. So as you can see, it has 3 parts. So you have the 2 rails. One is horizontal and one is perpendicular. And then you have the L bracket. So this one allows you to adjust the nodal point and eliminate the parallax. But it doesn't allow you to pan vertically. You can only pan horizontally. So it is perfect for single row panorama. If you want to take multiple rows panorama, this is not ideal for that use. Okay. Now the other type, what we call spherical panoramic head, and this is the one I'm using. This one allows you to pan horizontally and also vertically. So you can easily capture multiple rows if needed. Okay, I'm going to show you how we can set it up after this slide. And then finally, we have what we call the motorized panoramic head. So if you want to automate the whole shooting process, you can use this head. This is ideal if you want to create a massive, like very big photos with maybe 500 megapixel or 1 gigapixel. So you can use a telephoto lens like 200 mm, and then you put the camera on that ball head, and it will ask you to flag the upper left corner of the scene and the lower right corner, and then it will automatically calculate all the number of shots required to cover this whole area. So it will ask you what is the focal length, and just let it go. You just click start, and then automatically the head will move and cover the whole scene. So you may cover 200 photos, 300 photos to get this whole scene, and it's very difficult to do that using manual mode. Okay, great. So would you like to see how to set up the panoramic head? Okay, great. So this is a software called QDSLR dashboard. This should allow me to connect my camera. Make sure it's on. Great. Let me bring that. Okay, so this is the spherical panoramic head. As you can see, we have the horizontal bar here to adjust the nodal point, along with this bar also is used for the nodal point. So we need to align both, and I'll explain that. And then the vertical bar, this allows you to, tilt the camera downwards and upwards. So the first step to set up this gear is to make sure that your tripod is level. Okay, and we can use either the bubble meter, or we can use the built-in gyroscope of the camera to make sure that the tripod is level. So I have already done this in advance. I leveled my tripod using the leveling base at the bottom. Now the next step is to make sure that the camera is aligned on the rotation axis of the tripod. So what I will do, I will move my camera downwards, pointing down to the tripod. I don't know if you can see or not, but maybe. Okay. Can we turn off the light? Maybe you can see it better. No, no, bring it back. Okay, so just to see, I'm just. Just for you to see that. You see, this is the level, the bubble head. Okay. So what I want to do here, I want to align this middle of the clamp with the center of my camera, which is this square. So I'll keep moving the lower bar until I get that in the center. Okay. Of course, I want to adjust the focus here manually so you can see better. Okay, so that's the first step, moving the camera horizontally to align it with the vertical axis of the tripod. Once this is done, then you just need to lock the bottom bar. And then the next step is to fix what we call the nodal point. So to do that, can we increase the light a bit, or? Okay. So what I will do to simulate the parallax problem, I will use this light stand, considering that, let's say that's the tree, okay? And then I have to align this with any vertical line in the background. Let's say that's a building in the background. So what will happen now if I start panning my camera to the right? Can we increase the light over there, or difficult? It's the maximum, okay? Okay. Now pay attention here. You see there is a gap between this vertical bar and that line. It's not very clear, but if I go back here, you see that gap is no longer there. Yes. No, it's too dark, huh? Just open the aperture wide. Is it better now? That will not show. It will not reflect here the ISO. So aperture, just allow more light. Okay. So again, yeah, now it is clear. You see that bar here is no longer aligned with this line over here. But when I go to the middle, that bar will be aligned with, you see? Yeah. So this is what will happen if I take a photo like this, like one shot, and then I pan to the left and take another shot. The stitching software will be confused because it will see that vertical column in two different locations. So when you stitch both images, most probably it will fail, okay? So what I will do now, to fix that parallax effect, I have to change the axis of rotation from the body of the camera to what we call the entrance pupil of the lens. And I'm going to use a nodal rail to align that. So you don't have to do trial and error. Just in live view, make sure that you are moving the camera backwards until both lines are aligned. Can you see now what happened? I moved the camera backwards. Now this pole and the vertical line in the background are perfectly aligned. Now if I rotate my camera right or left, this vertical line will always be aligned with the vertical lines in the background. Is it clear? Yeah? So you don't need to do that every time, because you have a measurement on that nodal rail. So I can now see that at 50 mm on that rail, this is the no parallax point for that particular lens. So when I go back and shoot, I just put the nodal rail at 50 mm and done. Now bear in mind that if you are using a telephoto lens, this is a prime lens, 19 mm, right? If you're using a telephoto, the nodal point will vary based on the focal length. So at 16 mm will be different than 35. So maybe at home you want to calibrate your lens in advance. So you check where is the nodal point for 35 mm, where is the nodal point for 16 mm, and then write this down. Now, next time when you go to the scene or to the shooting location, you just set up the tripod on the exact measurement and done. Now you can shoot your panorama easily without having any parallax effect. Clear? Great. Now, let me show you one thing. Since we have the live view on, what I will do, I will change my camera back to the standard location. And now you can see the vertical lines are no longer aligned, right? So I'm now rotating on the standard axis of rotation. I'm not rotating on the nodal point of the lens. So why I'm doing this? Because I want to show you that rather than panning the head left and right, or the camera left and right, I'm going to use the shifting mechanism of that tilt shift lens. So this is the 19 mm shift lens, tilt shift lens. And now if I want to pan from right to left, I don't need to move my camera right and left. I can just shift the lens right and left. Without fixing the nodal point, you see when I'm shifting to the right or shifting to the left, there is no any change happening between the vertical pole and the background. You see? So what is happening now, I'm not panning the camera. The camera perspective is under control. It is still. But what is happening now is that this lens is moving right and left. But the camera itself is still. So when you do so, there is no any change in perspective. The sensor is not tilting right or left. It is still. But you are actually covering more areas from the tilt shift circle to get the whole panoramic scene. So I can cover here a very wide field of view, actually. You see, I can go all the way to the left, and I can get up to around 140 or 150 field of view using the 19 mm without need to pan right and left. Now, another thing you can do also is that if you want to shoot vertically, let's say you want to do vertical panorama, then what you can do is just you change the shift axis. So there is a button here on the lens that allows you to switch the shifting angle. And now I can shift vertically, see, and up and down like so. And if you notice, I don't need to tilt the camera up and down, and that is eliminating any distortion in the vertical lines, right? Because the perspective is still under control. So you're not changing the perspective. This is the technique I used to shoot the building in Paris. So I shifted all the way down, focus on the foreground, and then started shifting up, okay, making sure that you have enough overlap between each frame, and then finally we have a perfect panorama to stitch. Okay. I already took, before you arrive, I already used this lens to take a panoramic shot for this place, you know, and I'm going to show you how can we stitch that at the end. Okay. If you want to look at the shooting mechanism, also we can cover that. Okay, but still have so many things to cover. So I just shut it down and go back to our presentation. So in the next section of the presentation, we'll talk about filters. You know, so filters are actually a piece of glass that you can attach in front of your lens to achieve certain effect. Okay, and I'll explain what are the different types of filters and when we should use them and when we should not, because not all type of filters are compatible with shooting panoramas. There are some filters can create some issues. I'll explain that shortly. So in general, you have two different types of filter. You have the round filter and the square filter. Each one of them has its own use. So first of all, let's talk about the first type of filters, which we call the UV filter or ultraviolet filter. Nowadays, this filter is not really needed because in the past, this filter was used to eliminate the ultraviolet rays, which has an effect on the film cameras. Now, when you're using a digital camera, the sensor of the camera is not impacted by the ultraviolet rays. So you don't need to use UV filters to protect the camera sensor. But usually people are using that filter to protect the front element of the lens from scratches and such. So for that use, fine, okay, if you want to use it that way. But personally, I don't use UV filters at all because they tend to degrade the image quality. Okay, so even if it is very expensive UV, it will have an effect. So of course, when it comes to round or square, definitely it should be round because you want to protect the front element of the lens. Now, polarizing filter. This filter is used to increase this color saturation and reduce the reflections in non-metallic objects. So, for example, let's say you're shooting this scene, a waterfall, and you have the sun reflections showing here on the water, and that's preventing you from seeing the elements under the water surface. So you can use the polarizer to rotate it at a certain degree to cancel that ray or the reflection on the water. Okay. Now, in order for the polarizer to give you the best effect, you have to be at 90 degrees perpendicular on the sun. So if the sun is coming from, let's say, the right-hand side, and you have mountains in the front, you should not be facing the sun. It will not work, give you good results. To get the best result of the polarizing filter, you have to be at 90 degrees angle of the sun. So what happens is that when you are shooting panorama using a polarizer, and let's say there is a sun in the scene, the moment you start going towards the sun, the sky will look very dark. And when you are pointing away from the sun, the sky will look very bright. So imagine what will happen when you try to stitch this at home. You have this, the colors and the luminance of the sky is not consistent across all the frames. So that's why using a polarizer could be tricky when you're shooting panoramas. So be careful about that. Another type of filter, what we call the GND, or graduated neutral density filter. So this allows you to darken the upper portion of the frame to balance the exposure between the foreground and the background. So it's basically a piece of glass that is dark from the top and transparent from the bottom, and you can use that to balance the exposure between the sky and the foreground. Now you can see we have three different types of graduated neutral density. We have the soft GND, and you can see there is a soft transition here between the dark side and the bright side or the transparent side. And then we have the hard one. So this is basically, it's ideal for shooting, these two types are ideal for shooting seascapes. So if you have the horizon is very clear in the shot and you want to separate the sky from the foreground, you can use this one, the hard one. But when you have a scene that has, let's say, trees and mountains and you cannot see the horizon, then you should use a soft GND. Okay, now this one is called reversed GND, and this is dark in the middle, very dark in the middle, little dark at the top, and fully transparent in the bottom. This is ideal for shooting sunsets or sunrise. So basically you put the sun at the darkest side, and then the sky will be a bit lighter, and then the foreground will be very light. And this is how you can balance the exposure if you're shooting a scene like that. Of course, it makes sense to use the square filters because you want to align the horizon with the divider between the dark side and the bright side or the transparent side. So the square filter allows you to move it up and down to make sure that the horizon is aligned at the right point. Of course, the circular filter will not allow you to do that due to the shape of the circular filter. Then we have the ND or neutral density filters. So this allows you to block light completely, for the whole scene, to allow you to get a longer exposure during the day. Sometimes they do it also, use it in video shooting to, if you want to isolate the background, shoot at very wide aperture. This could allow more light to come into the camera. You can use ND filters to block the light and at the same time shooting at wide aperture to isolate the background from the subject. So again, you can use that normally with panoramas, no problem at all, because you have the exposure even across all the scenes. This is a special filter, we call it natural night light pollution filter. Maybe some of you might have heard about it before. This is good when you're shooting at night, and sometimes you get this yellow haze of light while shooting night shots. So this filter can allow you to cancel that frequency of light, the yellow frequency, and then substitute that with magenta color. So that can allow you to get some sort of blue sky easily while shooting at the night. Okay. Also, sometimes we use it to shoot the Milky Way to eliminate the light pollution a bit, from the scene. Maybe many people, they don't know about this one, the precision focusing tool filter. This filter is mainly used for night photography when you're shooting, let's say, the stars or the Milky Way, and it's, at that time it's very difficult to adjust the focus during that environment because you don't have enough light to focus on a subject. So usually you end up focusing on what? On the stars. That's the only bright element in the scene. Now the stars, they don't have lots of texture or details that allow you to easily adjust the focus. So you may look at the live view, adjust the focus, you think it is sharp, but then when you go back home and open the image on the big screen, you start seeing that your stars are not sharp as you thought. So if you use this filter, this is only temporary use. You attach it to the lens. What will happen? It will diffuse the light that is coming from the star and make it look like this, spikes. And then you start adjusting your focus manually until that spike in the middle is aligned between these two spikes. The moment this happens, it means that you have a perfect focus on the star. Then you can deattach the filter and start the shooting process. So if you are having difficulty focusing during the night on a star, this tool is very, very handy. Okay? Have you heard about it before, this one? Great. Now, if I don't have an ND filter, and I was in shooting with the tilt shift lens in Paris, and I wanted to shoot a long exposure because there was so many people walking, and I wanted to eliminate or take away the people from the scene by doing a long exposure during the day. But the problem is that the tilt shift lens front element is not straight. It has this concave look. So you cannot easily attach a filter on that particular lens. You need a special holder. And unfortunately, I didn't have that holder while I was there. And I still want to take long exposure during the day. So I cannot use my ND filters. So I use this technique to allow me to take long exposure during the day without the need to use ND filters. So first, you need to have a tripod, and you need to set your shutter mode to continuous high, as if you're doing wildlife. You need to take multiple shots, and then use a remote control, and you need to adjust a specific setting in the camera called multiple exposure. So if you go to the menu, shooting menu of your camera, I don't know about other brands, but this is in Nikon. I think other brands may have it as well. But in Nikon, you go to multiple exposure and you turn it on. And then it will ask you how many shots you want to take. It depends on the camera. So some cameras can go up to 9 shots. So what will happen, the moment you start shooting on continuous high, the camera will take, let's say, 9 shots continuously. And if each shot, let's say the exposure duration for each shot was 3 seconds, if you multiply this by 10 shots, this will give you a result of 30 seconds exposure. So what will happen, the camera will blend internally the 10 exposures and give you one raw file with 30 seconds exposure duration, simulated using 10 different exposures at 3 seconds exposure. Does it make sense? Now, if your camera does not support this functionality, you can still do that in post-processing. So you take the 10 shots, go to Photoshop, stack all the photos in the layers, like 10 layers, select all the layers, convert these layers to what we call a smart object, and then you go to the filter menu in Photoshop, choose a filter called median. So what will happen, this filter is located under the smart filter submenu in the layers menu in Photoshop. So once you select median, what will happen, Photoshop will blend all the 10 exposures together and give you an effect of long exposure. So that's a cool technique that you can use to simulate long exposure effect during the day. Now, the question that many people ask me, how many photos do I need to take a panorama, a specific panorama? Shall I take 1, 2, 3, 4? And what are the deciding factor to take 10 or 2 or 3 shots? So to understand or to answer this question, we need to understand a few things. One, the angle of view. So what is an angle of view? I maybe spoke that earlier, but let me explain it in more depth. Now, each lens has a specific coverage in terms of angle of view, depends on the focal length. And if you go to the specification page of that lens or on the website, for instance, for the tilt shift lens, you will find on the Nikon website or any other brand, you'll find 2 things here written. What we call the maximum angle of view in DX format on a crop sensor is 73 degrees. And on a full frame camera, the angle of view for the tilt shift is 97 degrees. Now, bear in mind that this is a diagonal angle of view, because we have 3 angle of views: vertical, how wide, horizontally or vertically the lens can see, but this figure is a diagonal, right? So this is higher than what you usually get on a horizontal or vertical mode. Now, if you know the angle of view of your lens and you know the field of view that you want to cover in the scene, so how many degrees you want to cover, you can use a specific formula to come up with the number of frames or tiles that you want to shoot. You don't need to do complex math. I will show you 2 different methods. One is so simple, using a calculator that you can download on your phone. Or if you are into math, I will show you also how to do it manually if you don't have this app. So next. This is an app called PhotoPills. You can download on the App Store or Android Marketplace. And you can see here what I have done. It will ask you to provide a couple of things. One, the camera type, because the application needs to know whether you are shooting with a full frame or crop sensor. Okay? So I put here D750, and it will ask you to define the focal length, which is 200 mm. Now, you don't need to put the subject distance. That's optional. But you need to define the orientation of the camera, whether it's portrait or landscape. The moment you do that, it will automatically give you the horizontal angle of view for that particular lens and the vertical angle of view as well. So you know how far or how wide this lens can cover. No need to do any complex math. Now, if you want to do it mathematically, this is the equation. So the angle of view is actually 2 multiplied by arctan, and then you have to divide the frame size by double the focal length, and then divide that by 180 over pi. It's a very long formula, but you know what? I tried it at home, to see how it works, and actually it works. And I tried on different focal lengths, and I came up with that table that showed me the various angle of view for each focal length, horizontally and vertically. And the reason I have done this because I want to come up with these two numbers, which basically tells me how many degrees I need to pan to cover a 360 degrees field of view. So in other words, if you're shooting with a very wide angle, like 14 mm, you need 78 degrees of stop. So it means that you can cover the 360 almost in 3 shots. So 1, 2, 3, 360 degrees, sorry, 180 degrees are covered with 3 exposures. If you're using a focal length that is very tall, like 200 mm, so you're zooming into the scene, it means they have very narrow field of view, so you need more stops to cover the 180 degrees. Okay? Now these two numbers are actually calculated as 20% overlap between each frame. Okay? So if you want to calculate the number of joined images in the scene, first you need to get the angle of view for that scene. You want to cover 180 or 90 or 10 degrees of the scene. So you want to figure that out from the location. And then assuming that we have a 20% overlap between each frame. So this means that the usable area in each image is around 60%. So to understand, so you have, like, let's say on one frame, you have 20% of that frame is gone or overlapped with the next frame, right? So 20% plus 20%, 40% minus 100%, 60%. So actually each tile will have 60% of usable information at the end of the panoramic stitch. So if you get the angle of view from the previous table, then you can use this formula to calculate the number of images. So it's not very difficult, but the angle of view, let's say you want to cover 180 degrees, you need to divide that by 60% multiplied by the angle of view of the lens. So let's take this example. Let's say you want to cover 180 degrees of field of view, okay? And you're using a 14 mm lens on a full frame. And you're shooting in horizontal layout, not vertical. So if I go back to the table here, the 14 mm horizontal angle of view was 104 degrees, right? So I know that I need to cover 180, and I have the 104 degrees. I just get the 60% of that angle, and then divide 180 degrees by that figure. So it will give you the number of images that you want to shoot. It's 2.88, around 3 photos at 14 mm to cover the whole scene, 180 degrees. Of course, if I need 360, I need to double that. So I need 6 shots. Now, that can sound complex and too much. I will not do all this math on the scene. So that's why I want to show you the easy way. Okay, you can use a website, and maybe you can also write down the URL if you want. It's pointsinfocus.com. And let me show you that easily. This, you can open that. You don't need to download any app, and you just need to open this URL, points in focus. Okay. So what I will do, it will ask you here for the sensor size, which is, of course, I'm using here a full frame camera. All what I need to do is just put the focal length, which is 14 mm, And if you scroll down, see, if, of course, just by putting 14 mm, it will tell you what is the angle of view for 14 mm, which is 104 horizontally and 81 vertically, and 114 diagonally. This is what is published on the website, okay? Now, if you scroll down, you see it will tell you the pano shifts. So it will tell you if you want to do 35% overlap, you need horizontally 67.5 degrees angle of a panning. So if you click on that number, let me show you. Okay, so this is, it will generate also this image for you to understand how it is done. So this is the scale of your pano head or the panning gear. And let's say you're starting from 0. So how many angles do you need here? We said 67.5. So from 0 to 67, and then another 67, and that will cover all that range from that point all the way to here. So I need 3 shots to cover this field of view. Okay? Now, if I'm using a telephoto, then I need, of course, more steps. So if I go back here and put, let's say, 200 mm, then the angle of view will be less, and I will need 7.5 degrees angle of rotation. Now, why I'm telling you this? Because if you are panning randomly, which many people do, right? Tuck, 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 take all the shots, and then when you go back home, either you shoot less than what you need, or you shoot too much more than what you need. And in both cases, you are having a problem. If you shoot less than what you need, then the panorama has failed. You cannot stitch it. And if you shoot more, then 2 things will happen. 1, the stitching process will take longer because you are stitching so many photos that are not needed. 2 is that if you have moving subjects in the scene, then this will generate more ghosting effect, because imagine there is a moving car, and you're taking, rather than taking 3 shots, you're taking 10 shots. Now your car will show in each shot, if you are panning in the same direction with the same speed, okay, the car will show in every single frame. So more cars, because more frames, then means difficult to remove while stitching in terms of ghosting. You got it? And this takes us to another point also. Which direction I need to take while panning? Shall I pan from left to right or from right to left? Also, I get this question as well. Now, if there is no moving subject, you should pan from left to right. Why? Because when you go back home and download the photos from your camera and you look at the film strip in Lightroom, you will see the sequence in the right order, from left to right. So visually, you will see the panorama in the same logical order as you shoot it, because the Lightroom will sort the images in that direction. However, if you have a moving subject in the scene, then you should shoot opposite to the direction of that moving subject. So let's say we have a car moving from right to left, or sorry, let's say from left to right, then I should pan from right to left. Why? Because if I pan at the same direction of the moving subject, then I will have more ghosting if I'm panning at the same speed. Whether it's a bird or car or walking people, when you pan following them, they will appear in every single shot. But if you pan the opposite direction, they will disappear. Clear? Okay. So far, so good? Okay. Yeah, break? Great. I think you deserve a break now. Huh? Okay, after. So 10 minutes, please, because we still have so many things to cover. Huh? turn off the light. Huh? Too much. You can have a look closer here. Okay. Right. Are you ready? Yep. Yeah. Great. So the next part of the presentation, we are going to talk about technical challenges and how can we overcome them. Okay. So one of the challenges that you may encounter while shooting a panorama, especially in low light, is focusing. You know, when you focus, as I mentioned earlier, it's not easy thing. I already spoke about that special filter that allow you to focus on the star. However, if you don't have that filter and you still want to focus in a low light, then you need to follow these procedure. So one, try to aim for the bright spot. You need to find any bright spot. It could be a star, it could be someone handing a light torch at the distance. So that's the first thing. You cannot focus in a total darkness by any means, of course. Then when you are adjusting your focus, you need to focus on the edge of something. So imagine we have a cityscape, and I want to focus on the cityscape. So what I will do, I will switch to live view mode, and then use the digital zoom on the live view to zoom into the scene, and then find an edge. Could be an edge of a building, an edge of a sign, whatever, and try to make that edge sharp by changing either the focus ring manually or using the autofocus if you have enough light. Okay. You can also use a flashlight in total darkness, so you can use a flashlight to temporarily make something bright, focus, and then you turn off the flashlight. And as I mentioned earlier, using live view can make it easy for you to do the focus. Some cameras, they have also the focus peaking mode, so it will highlight the subject in focus in different color. Could be red, or depends on the camera settings. That could also be handy. So next challenge is controlling the depth of field. Okay. Now, especially when you're shooting landscape, it's opposite to shooting portrait. You know, with portrait, you want to isolate the subject from the background. You want a very shallow depth of field. But in landscape shooting, or the cityscape, you want as maximum depth of field as you can. You want to cover everything, right? So the depth of field is actually the area where your subject will be in focus. Now, how can you control that area? Okay, there are different factors for that. Do you know how many factors to control the depth of field? Number, give me a number. 2 factors, what are these numbers? Or what are the factors? Aperture. What else? So subject distance. And the focal length. Any other element? Yeah, actually there are 4 things that control the depth of field. Okay, aperture, how wide or narrow is your aperture? The focus distance, so the distance between you and the subject. The focal length, so 16 mm, 200, 500, that could also impact the depth of field. And the 4th element, which is not very well known, what we call the circle of confusion. Or in other words, the sensor type, is it full frame or crop? I'll explain the circle of confusion in details in the next slide. But for now, just put in your head, it's just the sensor size for now. So if I want to expand my depth of field, so I want to either have a small aperture, so f8, f22, that could give you technically a larger depth of field. Short focal lengths, so the wide angle lenses naturally they have very wide or long depth of field. So the 10 millimeter or 16 millimeter will have very decent depth of field to cover your subject. The longer the focus distance, so if your subject is far from your camera and you're focusing on that subject at a distance, your depth of field will be wide, will be long. If the subject is too close to your camera and far from the background, then the depth of field will be less. And smaller camera sensors will have more depth of field. In other words, the bokeh on the crop sensor is not as good as the full frame. Okay? That's because of the circle of confusion, which we will explain later. Now, if you want to minimize or reduce the depth of field, in other words, you want to isolate the subject from the background, then you need to do the opposite. So wide aperture, long focal length, short focus distance, and larger sensor size will give you shallower depth of field. So far, so good? Clear? Okay. Now, circle of confusion. Now, what is circle of confusion? Basically, if we talk about the definition of that, so it's the maximum diameter of a blur spot on the camera sensor that will show as sharp or as a point. So forget about the definition. Let me explain it to you. Remember back when we were kids, we used to have the lens, put it under the sun, and then if you have a piece of paper and you get your lens too close, forget about the fire for now, but the spotlight of the sun will be focused, right, in a dot. If you put the lens a bit far, that dot will be blurry. And then if you go it closer to the paper, it will be sharp. And then if you go beyond that point, then it will become blurry again, right? This is what is happening inside your lens when you are focusing. So basically, when you are focusing, when you get a sharp image, sharp dot, this means that your focal point or the light that is coming from the subject is placed exactly at the focal plane inside the camera. So if your lens is either behind or in front of the focal plane, if the focal length is not adjusted on the focal plane, then the image or the pixel will be blurry, which what we call out of focus, right? Or beyond the depth of field, in other terms. Now, the question here, how far can I go in and out in order to tell that this point is blurry or not? There is a margin. So if you tweak the length, the focal ring a bit, you still get sharp dot out to a certain extent. That range is controlled by the circle of fusion. So the circle of confusion actually is telling you what is the size of the pixel or the light spot on the sensor that will be considered sharp. So in the full frame sensor, the diameter of the spot on the sensor is 0.029 millimeter. And on the crop sensor, it is 0.018 millimeter. It is less. So it means that the full frame camera will have a bigger range, right, to consider that pixel is sharp or not. You got it? Okay. Now, if you go too much beyond the focal plane, then the point will become blurry. So it's not a definite point. It's not like 0. Right? They still have a margin. That margin impacts the depth of field. That's why I mentioned that in the previous slide. And you have to put that in consideration while measuring the depth of field. Now, aperture, as we mentioned, this is one of the factors that controls the depth of field. And I mentioned if you have very narrow aperture, that could maximize the depth of field, right? However, you should not be shooting at a very, very narrow aperture because that could cause something called diffraction. And diffraction is actually will lead into softness in the image. You will lose some sharpness if you are shooting at a very narrow aperture, like f22. So shooting at f22 is not something that we encourage. So usually you should shoot at the sweet spot for that particular lens. Usually it's between f8 to f11, that range. Now, why this is happening? Let me explain that. Now, when you close the aperture, the blades becomes very close to each other, and the hole inside the lens, the aperture hole, will be very narrow, right? So what will happen when the light comes through the lens? It will hit the photons will hit the blades of the aperture, and it will deviate a bit. That deviation will not make the photons fall exactly on the right place on the sensor. They will tend to overlap. That overlap means less sharpness. So the image will be a bit blurry. Now, if you open the aperture, that impact will be less. So there is no chance for the light to be diverted because the aperture is quite wide. So that will give you a sharper image. Because people think, okay, if I want a very sharp image, I should shoot at f22, which is not correct. And if you pay attention here to the sample here, so we have same image shot in different apertures from f4 up to f22, and the sharpest result is between f8 and f11. You see f22, it's a bit blurry compared to f8. Why? Because of the diffraction that happened. Here? So if you want to maximize your depth of field, you should not be relying totally on the aperture. So try to do it reasonably, so f8 to f11. But put in mind the other factors, which is the subject distance, focal length, to shutter speed does not impact the depth of field by any means. Okay? So that will take us to another important point, something we call the hyperfocal distance. So forget about the definition now. Now the question here that I always get, where should I put my focal point when I'm shooting a scene? Shall I focus on the background or the foreground or the middle or where? In order to maximize the depth of field. That's a question that we need to answer. Where should I put? We all know, or we all agree, that focal point or the focal distance has an impact on the depth of field, right? As we mentioned in the previous slide. So in order to find that exact spot, we need to do some either math or use an application to tell you exactly where you should put that focal point, okay? I'm not going to cover the math part for now, but I will show you the app, which is much easier to tell you where you should focus. So I'll just escape here. And maximize this. Okay, so this is the PhotoPills app. And what I will do here, I will go to, first of all, the depth of field calculator, DOF. Okay, So what will happen here, the application will start asking you a few questions. One, what is your sensor size? So it will ask you about the camera type. When I say here D750, so it knows it's full frame. So that's the first element that affects the depth of field. Secondly, it will ask me for the focal length. So I will put here, let's say, 14 mm. And I will keep the aperture at f2.8. I don't care about the subject distance for now. Keep it for now. So if you look here at the diagram in the bottom, use the cursor here. Yeah. So this is your camera. That's the subject that you are focusing on. And it's telling you that between the camera and from the camera to about 2.21 meters, this area completely will be out of focus. Okay, so this is behind the depth of field. Now, after that range, everything would be in focus until either infinity or we have an end here. So if I change the focal length to, let's say, 200, you see our depth of field is not reaching infinity. Our depth of field will end at after the subject by 5.91 meters from the subject. So it means that in front of the subject, I have 4.78 meters in focus. Behind the subject, I have 5.91 meters in focus. And then anything between me and that number is out of focus, right? This is what it is explaining here. Now, the application will also tell you what is the hyperfocal distance. So it will tell you where exactly you should put your focal point to maximize the depth of field. So the first number here is the most important one. It is telling you at 471 meters, that's where you should place your focal point. Now, I know now you are thinking, how can I measure that distance, right? Two things. Now, if that distance is relatively close to you, okay, you can use augmented reality, which I'll show you now, to make the phone tell you where is that point, and you can focus on that point. If that is very big distance, like this one, what I do some planning before I go to the shooting location. So let's say I want to shoot Burj Khalifa from Shangri-La Hotel. And I want to know where should I put my focal point to get the maximum depth of field. So what I will do, I go to Google Earth, or I can even use photopills, and I can measure the distance between Shangri-La Hotel and Burj Khalifa, which is exactly 1.3 kilometers. Okay, so now I know the subject distance, and then I can try to find in between where is 400 meters from where I'm standing. So it will tell me, let's say, that hotel. So I know if I go to that location and I focus on that hotel, I will get the maximum depth of field, which is at exactly 400 meters or 471 meters. This is one way to do it if you are having a very large distance. You need to put your focal point behind that number, so closer to the subject. So if your main subject is Burj Khalifa, then you should not be placing exactly at 471. It should be at 480, somewhere in between the hyperfocal distance and the subject. Now, if I go back and I change my focal length to 14 mm, now it's telling me the hyperfocal distance is 2 meters, 0.30. Now, that's a close distance. So what I can do now, I can go to augmented reality, AR, and you see now the camera will show me two things here. So this is where I'm standing, okay? And that blue line is the beginning of the depth of field, okay? And that's infinity. Yes. Now I need to have my subject standing somewhere between these two lines. Don't put your subject here. Don't focus here. If you focus here, you will not get the maximum depth of field. If you focus exactly at this line, again, that will not give you the maximum depth of field. You should focus somewhere behind that blue line. Okay? You can try this even on a longer distance. Okay? But it's easier to do it on a shorter distance. So you can ask someone of your friends to stand somewhere here, and then you can focus on him and then ask him to leave. Now I can ensure that my depth of field will be the maximum. Clear? Okay, great. So back to the presentation. Okay, there is also in the app, you have the hyperfocal table, which will give you the best or the hyperfocal distance for each focal length based on the aperture. So you can print this and keep it with you if you want. Okay, now another technique to maximize the depth of field is to do what we call focus stacking. So focus stacking is actually a technique that allows you to take several shots with different focal positions, focal point positions, and then you can merge later on these shots together to maximize the depth of field. That's a technique mainly used in macro photography, right? So shooting many shots to expand or maximize the depth of field. We can still do the same in landscape as well. Now, the good news is that some cameras like the D850 has this feature built in. So it can automate the focus stacking process. Not the merging part, but the shooting process. So the camera will ask you, okay, where is the beginning of the subject? From where you want to shoot, and where is the end? So you define these 2 points, and then automatically it will take multiple shots and advance the focal point to cover that whole range. You will end up having a folder on your memory card with a set of photos. And these photos can be stacked later on using Photoshop or some other standalone software. Okay? So that's also a technique. Usually you don't need so many photos, like 10. Usually in landscape, 2 or 3 will be enough. So focus on the foreground, middle ground, and then background, and that's it. Why? Because usually in landscape you're using a wide angle lens most of the time, and naturally it has a decent depth of field, so you don't need 10 shots to cover the whole scene. Maybe 2 or 3 will be enough. Now, we are still talking about depth of field, but from a different perspective now. And maybe this is not a common approach in landscape. Mainly in architectural photography, they use this technique. But let me explain that. Using a PC lens or perspective control lens, or in other words, tilt shift lens, can allow you to maximize the depth of field in a way. So let me explain how it works. So basically, the tilt shift lens has 2 mechanisms. It has the shifting mechanism, which we explained earlier. So remember when I was shifting horizontally and vertically to do the panorama? That's one feature of the tilt shift lens. The other feature is the tilting mechanism. So the lens itself can tilt downwards or upwards, or even sidewards, left or right. Not shifting, I'm talking tilting. So it will bend. Now, what will happen here if the lens and the sensor are on the normal position, the focal plane is parallel to the lens plane. So the depth of field will start from the focal point, from the focal plane, all the way to either infinity or depends on the settings. Okay. Now, with the tilting mechanism, what I can do, I can tilt that focal plane either right or left. So I can tweak the starting point of my depth of field, in other words. So to give you an example, say, hey, we have 3 subjects here, glass, mouse, and keyboard. Normally, when your lens is at the normal position, no tilt, and we have a very shallow depth of field, so my focus is around this area. This is the only area in focus. Now, anything behind or after that point is out of focus. That's normal. Now, if I tilt my lens to the right, the focal plane will also tilt as well, which is represented by this green cone here. So what will happen here, the focal or the focus will start from close subject. See now the glass is in focus all the way to the keyboard. Now I don't need to do focus stacking here. What I have done with a single shot, I manipulated the focal plane. I tilted the focal plane to match the alignment of the subject that I want to shoot. Practically, when you're shooting architecture, let's say you have a bridge, and you're shooting that bridge from a diagonal, and you want the whole bridge to be in focus. If your focal plane is parallel to the focal to the lens plane, then imagine that is the bridge. Only this part of the bridge will be in focus, right? Now I can tilt my lens to the right and get the whole bridge aligned with my focal plane and get it all sharp end to end without need to do any focus stacking. Of course, anything on the right side and the left side of that focal plane will be out of focus, but I don't care. I only care about the bridge. This is what I want to make it sharp. Okay? So theoretically, you can use the tilt shift lens to maximize the depth of field. I wouldn't say maximize, but manipulate the depth of field to cover more area. But still, the depth of field is still the same, which is the range between these 2 points. That is not changing, huh? But it will be minimum when it is close to the sensor, and it will be maximum when you are far away. So the more you get further, the cone will be wider, and you can cover more subjects. This is how it works. Yeah. Composition didn't change because neither the camera nor the lens have changed perspective. The camera is still stationary, the lens is stationary, but what happened? The lens has tilted. That will not change the composition. It's still the same. It's still the same. Yeah. No, you're just tilting the focal plane. Exactly. Inside the lens. Yeah. Yes, exactly. Yeah. I'm not shifting. Yes. So if I am shifting the lens left and right, then the composition will change. Because like taking a panorama, you're shifting horizontally. Each time you shift, you get different composition. But here the composition is still the same, but you're just tilting the lens. And I can show it to you live if you want after the session. How can we control the focal plane using the tilt shift lens. Now another use for the tilt mechanism, if you want to create the miniature effect, which is sometimes it's a built-in feature inside the camera, but will only works with JPEG, to make the subjects look small as if they are shot from a very close distance. So imagine the situation. You are on a high level. Let's say you're shooting from a tower, shooting a cityscape, and you want that cityscape to look like a toy or a miniature. Okay? So what you can do, you can tilt the lens downwards. So actually what you're doing here, you are moving the focal plane to focus on one of the towers. So this tower will be in sharp focus. The tower behind and in front will be out of focus. So that will create a feeling that you're shooting this building from a very close distance because you have shallow depth of field. And this will simulate the miniature effect. And this is how it looks like. Okay? Great. So let's talk about perspective distortion and converging verticals. Again, that could impact also your panorama shooting process. So usually when you set up your camera to shoot a panorama, I told you have to make sure that your camera is level. If your camera and tripod are not level, and you start panning what will happen? You will end up having your stitch images in a curve, and then you will end up cropping from the top and the bottom to make it straight. Now, to minimize that problem, you need to make sure that your camera and tripod are level. Now, the moment you level your camera, naturally, the horizon will be in the middle of your composition. Because your camera now is upright, the horizon will be exactly in the center of your composition. Sometimes you want to make that horizon a bit up or a bit down to apply, let's say, the rule of thirds in the composition. So you want to give, let's say, 2/3 to the sky, or 1/3 to the sky and 2/3 to the foreground. And at the same time, you want to make sure that your lines are vertical. Now, if you are not using a tilt shift lens and you want to make your horizon up, you have to tilt the camera down, right? When you tilt the camera down, what will happen? All the vertical lines will start to converge. Why? Because the sensor of the camera is no longer parallel to the subject. So if you tilt the camera, then the lower part of the sensor will be further away, and the upper side of the sensor will be closer to the subject. So if it is close to the subject, then it will look bigger, and if it is away from the subject, it will look smaller. So that's why you look at the building like a cone shape, either like this or like that. Why? Because you are tilting the camera up and down. So, and this happens if your field of view, or actually angle of view of your camera, is not big enough to cover the subject. Like shooting, let's say, Burj Khalifa, standing very close, you want to get the whole tower. If your lens is not wide enough, you will have to tilt the camera upwards. But then what will happen? The tower will start falling back, or the vertical lines will converge. So there are ways to fix that problem. So one way to make sure that your perspective is, or that the vertical lines are straight, make sure that the camera is straight, parallel to the subject. Now, if your camera is not parallel to the subject, you can also do this technique. You can step up on a higher level or a higher ground. That could give you more coverage to that tall building. You can also use a short lens, shorter than the one that you're already using. Try to expand the depth of field. Or you can shoot panorama. Take several shots, okay, but with a tilt shift lens, which I will explain later. So 2 ways, or actually 3 ways to make the vertical line straight. Make your camera parallel to the subject. Stand on a higher ground. Use a larger focal angle of focus. So if all these methods did not work and you still need to tilt the camera, then you can still correct that perspective in post-processing. But the problem here is that the moment you stretch, this is in Lightroom, you have the transform, and you can start using these sliders to stretch the vertical lines. But the moment you do that, 2 things will happen. First of all, you are stretching the pixels away, apart from each other, so you will lose resolution. And then you will end up cropping the image at the end, because it will look like a trapezium, right? So you'll end up cropping to make it rectangle, and you lose image resolution. So it should not be the best way, right? So try to avoid that in camera, or use a tilt shift lens, as I mentioned. So with the tilt shift lens, use a shifting mechanism. So make sure the camera is parallel to the subject, and start shifting the lens up, and take multiple shots to cover the whole panorama. This is what I did in the previous example I show you. All the lines will be straight because the camera is not tilting either backward or forward. Okay, another challenge also that you may face, what we call the optical distortion. And this has nothing to do with the camera position. This is only dependent on the lens, okay? Especially the focal length. So if you're shooting a very wide angle, like 16 mm or 14 mm, you'll end up getting what we call a barrel distortion. So the vertical lines will start to look curved, especially on the edges. Now, there is another type of distortion. We call it the pincushion distortion. And this happens when you're shooting at a very long focal length. So 200 millimeter or 500, then you'll get the opposite effect. So the lines will still be curvy, but inwards, not outwards. And then the worst case, what we call the mustache distortion, which is actually the mix of both. Okay, and that's because the lens quality is not very good. So maybe you are using a wide aperture, a wide lens, and it's not very good quality. So it will give you both distortions. And this is very difficult to be fixed in post-processing. The first two are easily fixed using this slider, the distortion slider. This one requires creating more guidelines and using certain tools, maybe in Photoshop or even Lightroom, to straighten the vertical and the horizontal. So it will take longer time to fix, not straightforward. Chromatic aberration, that also could be a challenge, especially with some particular lenses. So basically, it happens when you're shooting in a very contrasty scene, like during the day, you have a building or a tree, and then you start getting this weird colors at the edges, like either magenta or green tint at the edges of the subject. This happens because what happens is that, when the light comes through the lens, usually you have the white color is actually composed of RGB, right? Now, ideally, the R and G and B should fall exactly at the same pixel. If there is any deviation happens in the light, due to the frequency of each color, then some colors will tend to fall on adjacent pixels on the sensor. So you'll start seeing magenta color on its own beside the edge of a certain subject. Okay, so this happens because poor quality lenses could produce this effect. But anyway, this is very easily fixed in post-processing. You just by checking remove chromatic aberration in Lightroom, and then the problem is gone. And what I will do, actually, I have created a preset in Lightroom. So when I'm importing all my files from my camera, I'm asking Lightroom to automatically apply that preset during the importing stage. So by default, all the photos will be having remove chromatic aberration and enable profile corrections enabled by default on all the photos. That will also reduce the vignetting and reduce the lens distortion, the second option. Now, white balance. Also, this is something critical when you are shooting panorama. If you are shooting JPEG, which is not recommended, but if you are shooting JPEG panorama and your white balance is set to auto, there is a problem. Because what will happen, the color temperature might vary from one tile to another, one frame to another. So one frame could be cooler than the other. And then when you go back home to stitch the photos, it will be very difficult to manage because first of all, you're shooting JPEG, so changing the white balance is not an option. And also secondly, each frame has a different temperature, so it would be difficult to stitch. So if you're shooting JPEG, then you have to set your white balance to manual when you're shooting panorama. It's a must. If you're shooting RAW, then it's okay. You don't care. Put it manual, set it auto. You can later on fix it if there is any variation. And usually what I do, I shoot RAW and I keep it auto, so I don't care. But before I stitch my photos, I want to make sure that all of them have the same white balance. So I just go, adjust one of them, synchronize the rest of the photos together, so I can have all the photos have the same white balance, done, and then you go to the stitching stage. Now, metering modes. This is something that can also impact the way the camera reads the exposure, right? So when you're exposing for a scene, inside the camera you have different settings that affects how the camera reads the exposure. So you have what we call the matrix metering, center weighted metering, and spot metering. So if you're choosing matrix metering, this is telling the camera that everything in my frame is important in terms of exposure. So the camera will do its best to balance the exposure everywhere in the scene. in the frame. Okay? Now, if you are shooting, let's say, a portrait, then the most important thing to be properly exposed is your subject. So you may change metering mode from matrix to center weighted. So whatever falls in the center of the frame will have higher priority in terms of exposure adjustment. So the camera will expose at the center, making sure the exposure is perfect. We don't care about the background. It could be either overexposed or underexposed. Now the third mode, which I use frequently, is the spot metering mode. And in the spot metering mode, you can select a particular point in the frame to force the camera to set the exposure properly as per the brightness level of that particular point. And I use this technique a lot when shooting landscape or cityscape, especially if I have huge difference in contrast between, let's say, the sky and the foreground. So we all know about a technique called bracketing and HDR. We'll talk about that later in depth as well. But I don't need to do bracketing. So what I will do, I will set my metering mode to spot metering, move my focal square to the sky. The camera will automatically expose for the sky. Take the shot, move the focal point to the foreground, take another shot. You end up having two exposures. One exposure properly exposed for the foreground, another exposure properly exposed for the sky. Then later on you can blend or do HDR for both photos together. So this is a quick way to measure the exposure on a certain spot, especially for cityscapes when you have a very bright billboards and signs in the street, and you want to make sure that you nail the exposure for those bright subjects in the scene. Okay. Now there is a cool feature in some Nikon cameras. You have something called expose for the highlights. So basically, it's a fourth type of metering mode. It works like the spot metering, but you will have an asterisk above that icon. That specific mode tells the camera the most important thing to expose for is the highlight, no matter where the highlight is. The brightest pixel in the scene will be very well exposed. Okay, so that's the best, by the way. When you have the luxury to shoot multiple shots, it's fine. But sometimes you don't have the luxury to shoot many shots. Maybe you have a moving subject in the scene, and you end up having only one exposure and has to be properly exposed. And if I have to choose between either highlights or shadows in terms of exposure, definitely I will go for the highlights. The highlights should be properly exposed because the shadows can be recovered easily in post-processing. You may end up having some noise, but you can use some noise reduction tools to get rid of the noise from the shadows. But if you lose the details in the highlights, good luck. It will turn into white, and it's very difficult to recover details even if you're shooting RAW, if it is beyond the dynamic range of the camera. Okay? And this takes us to another subject, which is histogram. And you know, all the cameras have histogram. And if you're not using histogram, please do. But first of all, you need to learn how to read it and how to use it. So what is a histogram? Histogram is basically a chart or a graph that tells you two things: the brightness level of your image and the number of pixels in each brightness level. So these spikes that you're seeing here are actually measuring the number of pixels in each luminosity zone. So here we have, on the right side, you have the highlights. Here we have what we call the bright midtones, dark midtones, and shadows. Okay? There is no such thing called right histogram or wrong histogram. This is a big mistake because it all depends on what you are shooting. So for example, if I'm shooting a portrait, let's say high key, the subject is white, the background is white. In terms of exposure, this is a very properly exposed image. But when you look at the histogram, you'll see a big spike on the right-hand side. This doesn't mean that your image is overexposed. It's just telling you that you have so many white pixels or bright pixels in the image. Vice versa, when you're shooting a low-key, black background, again, the subject is very properly exposed, but you'll have spike on the left-hand side, which is fine, because you have black background. If you're shooting a leaf, let's say, like that one. This leaf has no highlights, has no shadows, mostly are midtones. So your histogram will look like this. In the middle of the histogram, you'll have a spike, which is, again, completely normal. When you're shooting landscape or cityscape, usually you have mix of light types. You have shadows, you have highlights. So it should have, the histogram should spread across all the luminous levels if you're shooting a landscape, because it's hard to get a landscape all white or all black, right? But here is the thing: if your dynamic range of the camera, and I'll explain what is dynamic range later, is narrow, then you should make sure that you don't have spikes on the right side, because that means you have overexposed image and you lost some details in the highlights. Okay, so dynamic range is actually how wide your camera sensor can absorb and understand in terms of light variations between shadows and highlights. Okay, so the bigger the dynamic range, the more the sensor is capable of absorbing and understanding different levels of contrast in light, shadows and highlights. So Nikon is very well known with its high dynamic range capabilities, and that's why it's the preferred camera for most of the landscape and cityscape photographers. Now, the human eye can see around 24 stops of light. This is our dynamic range. So we can easily look at under the chair in the shadows, and I can see the details, and then I can switch my eye to a bright scene, and I can still see the details. So my eye, or our eye, has a very wide dynamic range. It can easily see details in different light conditions. But the camera, until today, it hasn't reached the dynamic range of the human eye. So the best cameras in the market nowadays, they can cover around 14.6, 14.7 f-stops of light between the darks and highlights. Now, that sometimes could be enough for the scene. So one exposure can be more than enough to cover everything, but sometimes it may not be enough. If you have very contrasty scene, very bright sky, very deep shadows, one exposure could be beyond or not powerful enough to absorb all this contrasty light. So what should you do in that case? You should take multiple exposures. Okay? So you can take more than one exposure, as I mentioned, either using the spot metering technique, or you can use what we call exposure bracketing. So you can tell the camera, I want you to expose 2 stops or 1 stop below and above the middle point. Of course, ND filters can be used, but I don't use GNDs or graduated filters to balance the exposure unless I'm shooting a seascape. If you are shooting a landscape and you have mountains and a sky, and you use a GND filter, the sky will be darkened, but also the mountains, the tip of the mountains will be also darkened as well. So I don't want to do that. So usually what I do, I take several exposures, and then I can blend them later on in post-processing. Okay? The exposure bracketing is just a method to automate that process in camera. So you ask the camera to take a specific number of shots with certain number of variations in terms of exposure. So it could be 3rd stop, half stop, 1 full stop, or 2 stops. Depends on how far you want to go in terms of bracketing. Usually between 3 and 5 shots should be more than enough. Now, another way also to do to fix that problem is to use the exposure compensation button on the camera. So you set the camera to, let's say, aperture priority mode, or can we keep the questions to the end? Sorry, but don't forget the question. Okay. So if you set your camera, let's say, to aperture priority mode, and then the camera will tell you, okay, the ideal exposure for this scene is 1/50th of a second shutter speed, ISO 100, aperture f9, let's say. But then when you look at the histogram, you still have an issue. Let's say there are some highlights that are gone. So what you can do you can go to the exposure compensation button. You click on that button, and then you use the dial in the camera to step down or up the exposure to force the camera to expose properly for the highlights. So this is like bracketing, but it's a manual way. Sometimes I prefer this method because I don't need to take 3 shots or 5 shots using bracketing. I only need 1 exposure to cover the highlights. So I just step down my exposure using the exposure compensation. Now, next step is to blend what you have captured, right? So this is a shot I captured in the Sheikh Zayed Grand Mosque. So we have, this is the normal exposure, and then 2 exposures less, 2 exposures above, and then I can blend all this using Lightroom or Photoshop and get a properly balanced exposure using HDR method. Okay, shooting techniques. In this section, we talk about how can we shoot panorama using various techniques. One of them is handheld, without any equipment. Now, usually what happens is that you hold the camera like this, okay? And then you start panning with your body. So take 1 shot, 2 shots, 3rd shot, and so on. This is completely wrong. Why? Because you are rotating on your own axis. You're not rotating on the nodal point of the camera, okay? So ideally, you should rotate around the axis of the camera, not your own body. So be careful when you're shooting panorama. I see so many people using their waist or feet to pan. The proper way to do that is to, this is a trick you can do. You can use your thumb, put your thumb under the lens, and then you start panning the camera and use the thumb as the center of rotation, not your body. Clear? This will lead into a better panorama. You don't have any waste in the top and bottom side of the panorama after stitching. Now, if you're shooting single row handheld, this is an example of shot I took in Italy. Again, this is 14 shots in vertical orientation, covering 170 degrees, leading into 48 megapixel resolution. Again, this is done handheld using the same technique I told you. Just put my thumb, camera is in vertical orientation, and then start shooting and overlapping. This is the one I did in Green Planet. Sorry? Yeah, this is the Green Planet, and I used here a tilt shift lens to make sure that all the vertical lines are straight. So I took 1 shot for the upper side, shifted down, and then took another shot for the lower side, and then I stitched them later on in post-processing. This technique, what we call HDR panorama, 180 degrees field of view, using a 19 mm tilt shift lens. This one I took in Paris. So basically, I was shooting inside a church, and I wanted to cover 180 degrees field of view from the bottom to the top. So I started with the lower side, and I took 3 exposures because there was different lights coming from the outside and inside, so 1 exposure was not enough. So I took 3 exposures for the lower side, and then I shifted up, take another 3 exposures, shifted up, another 3 exposures, and so on, until I reached to the top of the church, the ceiling. So that's 180 degrees. Then when I have done, I blended each row in 1 HDR, and then I stitched the results to generate that scene. Okay, thank you. All right, so again, this takes 2 things. Well, first of all, you have to imagine the composition, because you don't see that neither in the live view or the viewfinder. When you look through the camera, you don't see that composition. You have it just in your mind, right? So you have to visualize that first. And then when I have done, I started actually by tilting the camera and the tilt shift to cover this whole range. And I make sure that arc is in frame, because that's more important than the foreground. if there is any cropping here, no problem. But if there is a cropping here, there is an issue. So I tilted my camera, make sure that the farthest point in my panorama is covered. Then I went all the way down, start shooting from down up, making sure that when I reach to the top, that arc is in frame. Okay, so you have to plan that while shooting. And this is shot from a very low angle using a mini tripod. Now, another technique I use, what we call the light accumulation. So this shot was taken for the ring road. So can you see the light is not very much. It's a very low light in this scene. So what I have done, I started taking several shots during different times of the day to accumulate more light. So this one you can see there's a fountain, and this one has been lightened. Then another shot again. So I end up having like 33 shots, and then that was the final result. So this is light accumulation, right? So actually the sun set at Burj Khalifa during around 5 minutes time frame. It's varying from one scene to the other. So each shot has different spot of light here. Of course, I had to do different settings in the middle to freeze the fountain as well. So there is special exposure for the fountain, which is fast shutter speed, around 2.5 seconds, and then long exposure for the cars to have the car trails. So there's so many settings going behind the scene to compose that shot. This is this panorama. Yeah. Yes, vertical orientation. Yeah. Now, there's another technique. It's time blending. So this was done in Paris. So I was standing on a bridge facing Notre Dame Church, and I did one exposure here during the around 8:36 p.m. and mainly for the sky here. And then after 10 minutes later, I did one long exposure to smooth the water in the scene. And then I waited until 9:10 p.m. to capture this boat, because they only operate during this time period. Before that, there was no boats moving in the river. And then I was waiting till 9:25 for the city lights. So I took a forced exposure. All that time, my tripod is not moving. Huh? It's still. And then I blended all these together to come up with the final result here. So actually, this is a composite of all these 4 shots, same location. The tripod never moved. Camera composition is still the same. But if you break down this image, you cannot take it in one shot. So the sky is coming from that frame, the water is coming from this one, the boat is coming from that one, and the city lights are coming from the fourth. Okay, you can be creative, and you can shoot different times of the day, and you can blend that together to achieve certain results. Manually. You cannot use HDR for that, so I do digital blending to blend different portions of the image together. The HDR software will fail to compose that image. It doesn't understand which parts of the image is important. Is it the boat or the sky or the trees or the lights or what? So you have to manually enforce that blending process. Photoshop. Okay? So I do also digital blending courses if you are interested to learn this technique. Now, another technique also, which here I was in Italy and I wanted to combine multiple focal length. So basically, I shoot this scene using a wide angle lens, but then I noticed that the hotel is relatively small in the subject, and it's my main subject in that scene. So what I have done, I switched the lenses to 200 mm, took another image or another shot, zooming more on that hotel, and then later on I blended these 2 images together. So the first example was time blending, but this one is called focal length blending. You can blend actually multiple focal lengths to achieve certain subject or certain results. So you can do that as a panorama. So you can take panorama with wide angle, and then you take the middle frame, you can take it or recompose that middle frame using a 200 mm lens to magnify the main subject of the scene. Okay? So far, so good? Okay, great. So next, I would like to talk about photography composition rules. But because we are kind of running out of time, what I will do, I will hold this a bit, and I want to show you how to do the stitching process. That's more important. And then if we have time, we will cover this part. Okay? So actually, this part talks about composition rules, which I think most of you are aware of, so it's not very important. I will focus more on the stitching, okay? So I will jump to okay. So let's talk about the workflow. So when you're shooting Panorama, first you need to start with figuring out the composition, where your frame should start, where your frame should end. Choose the camera orientation. That's the next step, vertical or horizontal. Then you need to choose the appropriate length and the focal length based on the composition. Adjust the nodal point if required, if you have close subject in the scene. Make sure that your tripod and camera are level. Then you need to measure the field of view and figure out the number of steps that you need to take as per the equation I explained earlier. Lock the white balance, especially if you're shooting JPEG. If you're shooting RAW, no need to bother about that step. Then you need to check the depth of field, set the aperture properly, set the focal point properly to maximize the depth of field as per the hyperfocal distance we spoke about. Then you need to expose for the highlights, and ETTL stands for expose to the left, which means that you need to shift your histogram all the way to the left side. Sorry, it should be, I'm sorry, it should be ETTR. That's my mistake. That's fault. ETTR, expose to the right. So you need to expose for the highlights, sorry for the typo, to make sure that you are covering all the details in the highlights. Okay? Check the dynamic range. Do you need bracketing or one exposure is enough? And then you start shooting. So you pan and shoot, use a shutter release cable to minimize the vibration while shooting. So this is a summary, and just make sure that you remember to fix that. If you're taking a shot, it's ETTR, not ETTL. All right, so you wanted a slide, or? Okay, you took the shot. Great. That's a summary of the workflow for the shooting process. Now, in terms of post-processing workflow, so first you import the images from the camera, of course. You can assign, using Lightroom, some metadata and keywords to help you organize the photos. And then remove chromatic aberration, correct the vignetting, if there is any vignetting, fix the lens distortion. All that has to be done before you stitch the photos. And then adjust the white balance. If you're shooting RAW, you want to make sure all the shots have the same white balance. And then you have two options here. Either you create an HDR for each tile, if you took multiple shots, and then you blend them or stitch them using the Panorama software. However, last week, Adobe has released a new update for Lightroom and Photoshop. And that update in Lightroom has a very important feature, which is called HDR Panorama. So Adobe has enabled us to merge multiple exposure and do the stitching in one single step. Okay? And I'm going to show you a live demo on that after this slide. Okay? How can we stitch multiple shots? Because before, the workflow was different. I have to do the HDR first, and then you have to stitch, which takes very long time. Roughly, it could take 40 to 45 minutes to do the blending and the stitching. Now you can do it in 5 minutes or 3 minutes after the new update. Then after that, I don't do anything in Lightroom. I just go to Photoshop and do the magic over there. No, digital blending, all the bells and whistles over there. And then you can export the image either from Photoshop or from Lightroom, doesn't matter. But this is my workflow in terms of how can I import the images from the camera until the moment I export them for either web or printing. Okay, so let's look at an example for post-processing, but these are the various software that you can use for stitching your panorama. So you can use either Lightroom, Photoshop. This is my favorite, next to Lightroom, Giga by Color. And you also have PTGUI and Houdin, which is free application. My favorite is Lightroom. And then if it fails for any reason, then I switch to Giga. That's the plan B. But this one, most of the time, do the job. Like 99.9% Lightroom will do the job. Okay? Great. So before we learn how to stitch our photos, first we need to understand something very important, what we call projection modes. Now, what is projection mode? So basically, when you are shooting a panorama, you need to imagine that you are going to stitch that panorama within a sphere. Okay? So even if it is single row, that panorama will be part of that sphere. If it is multiple row, it will be 2 rows in that sphere. If it is 360 panorama, it will cover the whole sphere, right? This is called projection. So how you will project the image on that sphere, right? So in the stitching process, you will end up having, depending on the software, you will end up having multiple projection methods. So one is called perspective or planar. This particular method is ideal if you're shooting interior architecture, and you want to make sure all the lines are straight, no any curvature in the horizontal lines or the vertical lines. That's the ideal projection mode for stitching such images. This is the one I used for the Notre Dame interior shot. Now, the other type is called cylindrical. And there are 2 types of cylindrical, either inner cylindrical or outer. So you can shoot 360 panorama from inside a cylinder, and you will project from the inner side, or you can take the panorama from the outer side, like you can rotate around the building, or maybe like Google Earth, you can rotate around the Earth. Okay, that's a panorama for the whole Earth. That's an outer sphere panorama, right? So it's different. It's panorama, but stitched from outer side, not from the inner side. Okay. And that's the Google Earth example was for the spherical, of course. So you can cover the whole sphere either from outside or from the inner side. So when you are doing the stitching in post-processing, you will end up having these 3 options. Most of the time, these 2 options will give you decent results, unless you have an image like that with vertical lines that you need to maintain. Then you have to go for the perspective option. Because I see some people, they do it randomly, and they select the best result. Now you understand which one to choose, at least, okay? So let's do a quick demo on that one. So what I will do, okay. I'll open Lightroom. And let's choose an example like this one, because it's more complex than the rest. So this one, actually, this is the Notre Dame photo that I showed you earlier. So you can see now the 3 exposures for the lower side, for the upper side, and so on, okay? So I brought all the images into Lightroom. I make sure all of them have the same white balance. Everything is done, okay? What I used to do in the past, I used to select each 3 exposures, like so. And then I go to Photo Merge, and then select HDR. So then what will happen, Lightroom will create an HDR for these 3 exposures, okay? And then repeat that process for each row. It's very, very lengthy process. Now, if you noticed, we have a new option here in Lightroom called HDR Panorama. So what you can do now, you can select all the exposures, and then Lightroom will do the magic and do the HDR first for each row, and then blend all together. Okay? So what I will do now, I'll show you 2 in 1. So I will select all my exposures. Okay? Now I'll go to Photo, Photo Merge, HDR Panorama, and I will change my projection to perspective because I know that this is a architecture scene. I want to make sure all the lines are straight. And you can see now it's doing now what creating HDR panorama preview. So what is happening now, Lightroom is blending each exposures together. Okay. Until it's finished, I can just explain what is happening here. So create stacking or create stack, this will create a virtual stack or group inside Lightroom and put all the images for that panorama in one virtual folder. We call it stack, just to simplify the organization process of the files. Okay. So let's wait until it's done. It shouldn't take much time. Remember, we are doing here stitching for raw files. Huh? Now, if I'm doing stitching for JPEG, the process should take, it could be 5, it could be 7, it could be anything. It doesn't matter. Creative Cloud, this is the 2019 update. Almost there. Okay? So it's done. All the exposures are covered. Now, if you see this, this is normal because I had to tilt the camera a bit up at the end of the frame. But normally, if you did not tilt the body of the camera, you should get all straight as such. So if you want to fix this, you have 2 options. Either you can use what we call the boundary warp slider. So if you take the slider all the way to the right, then it will straighten the vertical lines. And now I don't need to do anything, right? In terms of cropping, it's perfectly aligned. Auto crop, so it works side by side with the boundary warp. So if I go, let's say, step back and choose auto crop, then it will crop all the unwanted pixels to make sure that the image is still straight. But I lost here some resolution, right? So better I keep the auto crop unchecked, use the boundary warp first, make sure we get the best results. If then no crop is needed, no need to check that. The auto settings checkbox will just adjust the tonality of each HDR file created before the stitching process. So it will just auto tone the images to have this properly exposed. I see that the image is almost done. All what I need maybe some color grading to achieve the same effect I did earlier. But in terms of exposure, you see the windows here are properly exposed. The shadows are properly exposed. And the whole process took how much? Like 3 minutes, 5 minutes? Versus 45 minutes in the past. It's a huge difference. So thanks to Adobe for this update. And by the way, this functionality is also available in Adobe Camera Raw as well. So inside Photoshop, if you open Adobe Camera Raw plugin, it also has the same feature. Okay. Now let me show you one more example. So I will not go through the merging process because this will take some time. But there is nothing more to learn. But let me show you one more thing. So I'll just cancel this. Remember, what you were seeing now was just a preview, not the actual panorama. You have to click Merge to complete the whole process. So what I will do next, I want to show you a different software called AutoPano Giga. Actually, this is a trial version. But for the sake of the demo, we can use it fine. So now before you come, what I have done, I took, using the tilt shift lens, I took exposures, shifting horizontally for this class. So the moment you import the files, just it will start doing some analysis. So it's telling me we have now 5 images shot with 19 mm, and then we have the settings of the camera here. Now, the moment I click detect, it will generate a preview. For that image. Now, that preview could take a bit longer compared to Lightroom, because we are handling here a raw file. But while it is working, this is the good thing I like about this software, that you can multitask as well. So I will bring another panorama. It's done, huh? Okay. So let's look at this as well. So we can do two panoramas. So this one, actually, the one I did in Italy, handheld, 19 images. This is JPEG, so it should take less time. You can do batch processing. You can add as much as you want. With a single click, you can merge everything. Okay. Now notice here something. Because this is an interior shot for that scene using the tilt shift. See, of course, all the vertical lines are maintained straight. There is no any, you see, if you compare this to that in terms of wastage or waste for the pixels, of course, here is much less because I'm using tripod with a tilt shift. Everything is level. But here, because I'm handheld, of course, I try to do my best to align each shot in the handheld to make sure it is straight, but still, I'm losing some pixels here. Now, the thing I want to point out here is that automatically, AutoPanoGiga will select the best projection method based on the nature of that image. So, see, the projection here is planar, which is actually perspective, the equivalent of perspective in Lightroom. Here, it was cylindrical, because this is 180 degrees panorama. So, it will automatically detect that, but you can override that settings if you want. Now, let me show you something here. Now, if I go to the edit mode for the bigger panorama, of course, here you can do cropping, you can align the horizon, everything. But the interesting part here is that if you click on images mode, this will show you how the sequence of the panorama was done. So I'm shooting here from right to left. And then if you hover over every frame, it will tell you how much overlap is happening here. Now notice something, because I'm doing it handheld, without any math, without anything, I'm taking more shots than I need, okay? And this is very true here. So if I remove, let's say, exposure number 2, this does not has no impact on my panorama. So if I go here and remove, let's say, exposure number 5, still, everything is working fine, okay? So you can, this tells you something, that if you do the right math, use the right equipment, you can take the proper number of shots needed to compose your panorama. Now, I want to escape this one. For now, I want to show you something else. So let me zoom in. I'll magnify this a bit. Yes. Just to get a watermark at the final result. Yeah, you can do that, but it'd be too much. Yeah. Okay. Okay, so I'll just undo that step. Yeah, let me zoom in further. I want to show you something here. You see this guy here? That's what you call parachute, huh? And see, that's a moving subject, okay? And then you see in frame number 1, frame number 2, frame number 3, it's changing its position because I'm shooting continuously, okay? And thanks, I'm using 70 mm, so I'm getting decent details here. But this problem will be automatically fixed by the stitching software. So it will detect that this is a ghosting or this is a repetitive subject, and then it will automatically remove that subject. If the subject hasn't been removed, you can still mask that subject inside the software, or you can remove that frame if it is redundant from the panorama itself. Okay? Now, to show you the final result of this panorama in 4 resolution, so I'll just minimize that. And let me explain that. Okay. Now, when I was working in Photoshop, I thought this is a dust on the sensor, but then when I zoomed in all the way here, so I said, no, let's keep it. Okay. So on a you can see how far. This is the beauty of Panorama. You can get lots of details, lots of texture. 70 mm. And if I zoom all the way out, you cannot see that guy at all. Huh? At this magnification level, it's nothing in that scene. Huh? Again, handheld. So this is 220 megapixel. 170, I think. Yeah. Okay. So of course, I did the stitching in Lightroom, and then I went to Photoshop, and I used some color grading software to grade that file. Now, the challenge with this type of panoramas is that you need a very powerful PC to do the post-processing, because the moment you load it in Photoshop and start doing some adjustment layers, and you just copy the layer, that file will jump from 2 GB to 4 GB easily. So you need to do the post-processing in a creative way to make sure that you're getting the full results without any loss in quality. Okay? So those were 2 different examples on Panorama. And okay. So now we can open the door for questions before we wrap. So first of all, thank you for everything, and now we have questions.
Thank you, Mr. Karim.
Thanks.
We are coming to the end right now. If anybody has any questions, please raise your hand, and then we'll, after a few questions, we'll go and take a group photo in the reception area, please.
Have you tried astrophotography in this
Yes.
panels?
Yeah.
What kind of challenge you faced there?
Well, of course, the focusing, of course, during the light condition is very low, so you want to make sure that you nail your focus. So I use different techniques, as I explained earlier, that zoom to the live view, make sure that you have sharp focus using the live. I think that's another question similar to the same subject, so I will answer both. So yeah, you zoom in using the live view, trying to use manual focus to adjust your focus. The other challenge is using, I was shooting the full arc of the Milky Way in Panorama. So you want to make sure that you adjust everything up front. You level your tripod, because if the tripod is not leveled, especially in the desert, and you start panning, if you pan while not having a level tripod, you may lose the arc of the panorama of the Milky Way. So everything has to be properly adjust it, and then finally, the panning process itself during the darkness, to look at the number of stops between each frame while not able to see the scale of the panning gear. It's a challenge. Luckily, I was having the index rotator with me, so I was able to, again, lock the number of stops that I need for my scene, and then I just started shooting blindly because I know everything is set up. The tripod is level, the number of stops is controlled, exposure is adjusted, focus is adjusted, and then that was it. But luckily, I did some planning. I know what type of gear I need to use before I go to the location. Of course, I used also photo pills to use augmented reality to figure out the best composition for the Milky Way with the foreground. Sometimes also I did time blending with the Milky Way shots, because you want the foreground to be bright and the Milky Way also appearing. So sometimes I shoot during the sunset, the foreground, and then I wait till the proper timing in the evening and then take a photo for the Milky Way and then blend both together. And of course, use some color grading techniques to make the scene match in terms of light. So, the foreground will still look as if it was captured during the night using some color grading techniques, and then you can blend that with the sky. So that was some of the challenges I faced in astrophotography. Yeah. Any other question?
Yeah.
Yeah.
In HDR technique,
Yes.
using Lightroom, sometimes I'm getting weird edges, like say, for example, not architecture, but like say trees in a landscape composition. I'm getting like when I put it on HDR before the latest update that was released last week.
Ghosting, you mean?
I don't know what it is on HDR. Like, let's say I get using the same leveling, same tripod, same everything, but like say on the edge of if I zoom, if you zoom out, you get like very nice image. But when you zoom really, expand the.
When you zoom in, yeah.
You get like white edge on the edge of each. Like, does this happen to you sometimes?
White. You can get black.
Gray or white.
That could be vignetting.
It's different. You can tell it's the like 3 exposures or 4 exposures blended. You
Okay.
Can tell. I couldn't know. I mean, I didn't know how to get rid of this.
Well, this could happen if your tripod has moved between each exposure. So
if it's windy a bit.
if
Maybe
it is
was
windy, yeah, and the exposures are not perfectly aligned, then that could lead into such problem. So Photoshop or Lightroom tries to do some auto alignment to align the exposures together before the stitching, the blending happens. But sometimes that doesn't work. And you have to align the photos manually in Photoshop. So you stack them as layers, and then you change the blending mode to difference in the layers in Photoshop. Send each exposure to Photoshop as a separate layer. There's an option in Lightroom to do so. So you select all the shots, right-click, edit in Photoshop as layers. So each layer will be stacked, the 3 exposures. Select the layers, change the blending mode to difference. So you can visualize the variation between each frame. So you see some edging, happening because they are not properly aligned. And then use the arrow key on the keyboard to nudge the image left or right, up and down until you align the exposures properly with your eyes, and then you start doing. If auto alignment fail, you have to do it this way. You cannot use. Okay, that's a different story. Now we're talking about ghosting problems. Now, there is in the HDR software, by the way, when you do the HDR panorama, you lose some control on the HDR merging process. If you merge the exposures manually using Lightroom, you have an option called deghosting. So in the deghost, Lightroom, it has 3 settings: low, medium, and high. So if you select the deghost option, Lightroom will try to analyze the 3 exposures or 5 exposures and see if there is any variation in terms of the pixels between each one, and then it will detect that this is a moving subject, and it try to remove it from the other exposures and keep only one of them. So it will minimize the ghosting effect. Yeah. Yes. Yes. Then if that fails, okay, so first you auto-align. Secondly, you use the deghosting option in Lightroom. If both failed, then the only option remaining is to do the blending manually in Photoshop. So you stack the layers together, and then you use masking technique to mask the bad pixels from that particular layer, and then reveal the good ones from another exposure. And this is one of the reasons for doing digital blending manually. Yeah, it's a good question. Please.
Please.
Hello, everybody. This is Tamer Adwan.
Hi, Tamer.
Thanks, Karim. Thanks for everybody coming today. It was useful, really. I just only need to ask you for the new photographers who come to this field and they don't know exactly how to start, especially for street photography, landscape, or portrait, or whatever, something else. So in a simple way, can you just give us on a small brief how they can start, or they can choose exactly what they can?
You have, how do you start, or how do you select the genre?
Exactly, because people also, they have camera, or they have just like lens
Okay.
kit, or kit lens. They don't know exactly what to shoot, you know. So what do
Yeah.
you suggest for them? How
I'll
they
just
become professional?
Talk about my personal experience. So when I started, I tried almost everything, like street photography, portrait, landscape, cityscape, astro, many things. So I have to, because if I did not try these type of genres, I will not be able to tell which one is my favorite. So I had to go through the exploration stage at the beginning. And then I felt like, okay, landscape and architecture and cityscape is my favorite genre. It's just a feeling. Huh? You feel like this is close to you, to your heart. And then you start investing more study, gear in that type of genre. Because if I chose, let's say I decided to go for macro photography, my way of thinking and studying would be, and the investment in the gear would be completely different. So I have to go into
Different setup.
exactly. So I see sometimes people are just getting started, and they go and buy everything they can without even knowing which direction they will follow. And then, okay, they go and invest into very expensive gear for macro, but then at the end of the day, they don't like macro. So why did you buy the gear, right? So first, figure out what is your personal interest, and then start doing the investment. Investment, not just the gear, but also knowledge. This is one thing. Secondly, you need to expand your, what do I call, the visual experience. You know, like you watch so many photos for other photographers and try to have this in the back of your hand. Yes. So when you're going to the scene, you start to, recall these type of shots or compositions or techniques done by other photographers, and try to apply them and learn from them.
Thanks, Karim. Thanks, Hipa.
And thank you very much, everyone. Thank you, Mr. Karim, for
Thank
the
you.
beautiful lecture.
And thank you for all of you. Thanks. Thank you for coming.
You can now go and collect your certificates of attendance from the reception desk, and please do not forget the group photo at the reception area. Thank you very much.
Thanks. So the group photo now or later? There? Certificate. Okay. تفضلي. خلي